Now we're in chapter 5, and we're talking about the hydrology and physiography of wetland habitats. Physiography is an old term, but it is a nice one because it captures what we're doing here. It talks about the geography, and it talks about the physical nature, the geology of how these systems form and persist. Wetlands are crucial to waterfowl, wildlife, and plant life. There's a lot of biodiversity that's associated with it. You may remember also that they provide vital ecosystem services such as waste purification and flood control, and they're responsible for a large amount of the value, economic value of fresh waters on the continental areas. That's because the area value of the area value per hectare area is substantially higher than any other habitat for the most part. They're also the most endangered aquatic habitat because people have used them, drained them, filled them, used too much of the water, a whole bunch of different reasons, but we'll talk about how endangered they are. So here we have the global distribution of wetlands, intermittent rivers, perennial rivers, intermittent lakes, and perennial lakes. And we see that there's some areas that have quite high numbers of wetlands. Other areas that they're completely absent. So why would you think that wetlands would be completely absent in this part of Northern Africa? And you can chat in there. First question of the day. Yeah, got it. Low precipitation, it's in the desert, right? So that's pretty straightforward. And you see similar things in Australia and Namib Desert, the Mongolian deserts, the deserts along the west coast of South America. Okay, here's another question for you. So look at all the wetlands up in the Arctic. It turns out that the average annual precipitation in the Arctic is actually quite low. It's almost desert-like in many of these areas. Yet there's a huge density of wetlands in the Arctic. Why do you think that with low precipitation, there would be a whole lot of wetlands in the Arctic?
There's no evaporation, so it can't accumulate rain.
Right, yeah, that's a good one, right? So the temperatures are so low, so the evapotranspiration rates are really low, right? But then somebody also said trapped water. I think it was Abigail. Abigail, what did you mean by that? Okay. Somebody mentioned something about permafrost. What happens to the groundwater in permafrost, where there's permafrost?
Usually it's frozen solid.
Yeah, right, exactly. So the groundwater has no, like here, if a lot of rain falls, a bunch of it's going to go down, right? Go down and go out. It's not going to be stuck in a wetland, right? It's just going to go out. There, it doesn't have anywhere to go. It's got to flow across the surface somehow to get out when it does melt. So the cold temperatures lead to permafrost, which doesn't allow water to percolate very far down into the soil, and it doesn't allow for much evapotranspiration. So even though you don't have much precipitation, we have a lot of wetlands in those areas. So wetland is a weird sort of catch-all term in the sense that there's a whole lot of different types of wetlands, and they have different characteristics. So the first ones are coastal ones, and these are variably fresh and salt water, and they become fresher as you move in. And also because of tidal cycles, you'll have different degrees of brackish water. So when the tide's going out, you might have pretty much fresh water. When the tide's going in, it might be ocean water. These include salt marshes and mangrove swamps. Salt marshes are really important in the United States, and important places for fishes to reproduce and shelter and biodiversity. Mangrove swamps are only in the southernmost parts of the United States. more typical of tropical areas and subtropical areas. They will become more abundant in the United States over time. Why is that?
It's heating up.
It's heating up, right? Climate change is making more of our area subtropical. These are really important in protecting coastlines. They actually build the coastlines out by trapping sediments, and then when hurricanes come in, they protect communities and land from the force of the water. So when there was a giant tsunami in Southeast Asia, the communities that had destroyed all their mangrove forests suffered tremendously from the waves that came in. The ones that had left the mangroves were much less affected because it slowed down the force of the water. Mangrove swamps and salt marshes are disappearing. Freshwater marsh is what we might see around here. Further south, cypress swamp, we talked about those earlier in a lecture. Those are essentially trees coming out, and they have those knees, those knobs that are helping them get oxygen into the plant. North of us, we have prairie potholes. We don't have many prairie potholes here, but if you go north, starting into Nebraska and working your way, you have these small wetlands. What do you think formed these? And why is there a line where we don't have them here, but they're further north from us?
Was that glaciers?
Yeah, exactly, Cassie. So glaciation, and we'll talk in much more detail about the processes that lead to formation of lakes and wetlands in the chapter on lakes. But basically, they scooped down and they left chunks of ice embedded in the till, and then as they left, those chunks of ice melt and left these small depressions. These are endangered from agriculture, and you can see cropland here, but not here. Very important for reproduction of waterfowl, one of the major waterfowl production areas in North America. So there's also history in wetlands. They've played a big role in human history. There are many wetland areas where diseases were worse. So for example, on the East Coast, malaria in the lowlands of the East Coast and the southeastern United States was really important early in European occupation. And it actually played a role in the inability of the British to respond to the revolution, the American Revolution, because the British troops could not camp where they wanted to. They were getting decimated by diseases that were carried by malaria. And so this is something that's been, maybe you can see why people maybe were draining a lot of wetlands, because there were some diseases that were associated with it that caused some real problems. Now we've gotten rid of malaria in the United States because of this. It could come back because it's warming up. We have more habitat that's suitable for the mosquitoes that carry malaria. The marsh Arabs in Iraq, there were people living in this area since ancient times. So this is where Mesopotamia was, sort of the cradle of part of civilization. And many of these people were living in wetlands, which is now much drier than it was then. And the marshes are still there. The marsh Arabs are still there. The Iraqis are really doing some damage to them, both by water extraction and also just going after the people that live in these marshes. And there's another area that's interesting in archaeology. They got the bog bodies in Northern Europe. So this is a picture of a bog body. And people dig down, when they're digging down into these areas that have bogs and into the sediment, they'll find these bodies that are thousands of years old and just perfectly preserved. You can see that this person was wearing a leather cap when they were put in, and the leather cap is still there. Oftentimes they've been strangled, and they've been preserved in those for several reasons, which again we'll get to when we talk about carbon dynamics. One is that when you're in Northern Europe, things are pretty cool. So decomposition happens slowly. Another is that the bogs themselves are acidic, and this is from the processes of fermentation. and that causes more acidity, which then slows the further action of decomposition. And we take advantage of this with foods like sauerkraut and kimchi and naturally fermented pickles and other fermented foods. The acidity is part of what preserves them. So the cool temperatures and the acidity are important. And then when they're down in the bottom of the bog, it's anoxic. And carbon utilization is less efficient in anoxic conditions, the lack of oxygen. So these three things, lack of oxygen, temperature, and low pH, preserve these bodies. Why they're there, people don't really know. They might have been, many of them seem to have been killed, strangled, and thrown in there. And whether it was some sort of sacrifice or punishment, that's just not clear now. You can also see that this person, you can see some of their hairs left and some of their whiskers are left too. The other interesting thing that happens to these is that when they get exposed to oxygen, they will, brought up to the surface, they will rot within days. And so these preserved bodies are then kept cool and put in a zero oxygen environment to further preserve them. Next, we'll talk about wetland losses. 70% of the United States riparian wetlands are lost. So many wetlands are associated with riparian areas. Do you guys know what riparian areas are?
Is it just river related?
Right. It's along the edges of rivers. Right. And so what do you think the processes are that are causing the loss of wetlands along the edges of rivers? Cassie said agriculture, but we need a little bit, maybe a little bit more specific than that. Maybe erosion a little bit.
The soil next to the rivers is really like fertile, so they take that.
Well, yeah. So a lot of farmers put a lot of farmers put their cropland next to rivers because it's quite fertile, right? So then what do they do about floods? Dams and barriers, right? So basically levees. They build levees to keep the floods from coming in and taking away their crops, even though historically the floods would come up and then come down. That's why it's rich land. They'll build levees and channelize the rivers to get them to come out. And then somebody wrote drainage. Yeah, so the other thing they'll do is they'll build a levee to keep the water out, and then they'll drain all the water behind the levee to make more cropland. So those are some other areas.
Is a levee the same as a dam?
It's kind of a dam. It's a dam along the edge of a river, if you want to think about it that way. Yeah. So it's just a long, high, low dam that keeps the water from leaving the river when it floods.
Like bumpers and bowling?
Like bumpers and bowling, yes.
Okay.
Exactly. And the cities have the most levees. So like if you go to St. Louis, there's giant levees that keep the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers from flooding downtown. But even Manhattan, the city of Manhattan, Kansas has levees. We have a levee that goes all the way around our town that we use as the linear trail for recreation, but its primary purpose is when it floods to keep the water from flooding downtown. In 1993, the water was as high as right up to the top of that levee. It didn't come across. In the flood in the 50s that changed the Blue River channel, there was not a levee there yet. And there also weren't reservoirs to stop the water from coming in. And the water got up as far as City Park. So we had some serious flooding. 50% of the prairie potholes are gone. And I already talked about that. That's just agriculture. They just drain them and push them out. Many parts of the Midwest, they've drained typically wetland areas by laying drain tiles down underneath the soil and then digging the streams deeper, and the water goes down and hits these drain tiles and comes out from below and then goes down down the channelized stream. So they've basically just drained what were naturally wetlands and turned them into cropland. 22 states of, oh, go ahead, Emma.
I was wondering if that kind of thing is like illegal. Are they allowed to do that every time?
So
It's their land?
Only fairly recently in the history of the United States has draining a wetland been against the law. And even now it's not against the law, but you have to do certain things to mitigate the damage that you've caused by doing so. In addition, the current administration has attempted to redefine what are the waters of the United States. And the statutes are based on navigable streams or rivers. And so things that are not connected directly to navigable streams or rivers are not necessarily going to be protected. Before this administration came in, the Environmental Protection Agency worked up regulations that recognize that small streams and wetlands are connected either directly to small streams or less directly through groundwater to larger streams, so that we have the legal authority to control, to regulate what happens to those wetlands and streams. But now that's been reversed and it's in court, so we'll see what happens with that. The United States is not alone. Many wetlands have been lost in other countries. So Cameroon's in Africa, 80%, New Zealand, 90%, Australia, 95%, Thailand, 96%, Vietnam, more than 99%. In some of these countries like Thailand and Vietnam, many of the wetlands have been converted to essentially rice culture. And they're still sort of a wetland, but they really don't have the diversity or any of the other ecosystem services other than production of crops.
How many wetlands did Australia have before? Because I mean, like percentage-wise, I'm sure Thailand and Vietnam had a lot, but if Australia had like 2 wetlands and both of them got drained, then that could be kind of misleading, right?
Right, that's a good point. The total number is substantially, well, probably substantially higher in Thailand and Vietnam. Yet Australia is also a much huger area, so it could also have, even though the wetlands are sparser there, they could be there could be more than you'd think. And also in an area that's dry, you can end up with wetlands because when it does rain, it forms a wetland, and then the wetland's not permanent, but it's wet enough to be a unique habitat. And that's also a good point, because some of these areas that do have wetlands and dry, they're so rare that's a really important habitat. So for example, the wetlands in California in the Central Valley are the home to a lot of endemic plants, and they are just being developed over, right? So even though there's not that many wetlands, you're losing a high percentage, and it can cause problems. So it's also possible that if you lose a high percentage in an area where there's not many wetlands, that's the biggest problem, not the total number of wetlands that's lost. But that's a good question, Tom.
Do you think there's any problems where, so we're going over the problems that if you lose wetlands, is there any problems created by making wetlands where there wasn't previously?
There are potential problems when we get to the global carbon cycle. Methane and nitrous oxide are produced by wetlands, and those are both greenhouse gases. And so rice culture creating a lot of wetlands where there weren't wetlands could have that effect. Okay, so here's percent wetland loss by state. We're not the worst. You can see the very worst ones are sort of in the grain producing areas of the Midwest, right? The wetter grain producing areas of the Midwest, and California, as I suggested. Alaska's lost a very low percentage of their wetlands, and Oklahoma and Arkansas have lost a good amount. We're sort of in the middle of the pack, right? We've sort of lost half of our wetlands. Most of the wetlands we have are in the western part of the states, and they're what are called playa lakes. and they're temporary, essentially wetlands that are formed by deflation or wind. And then the remaining wetlands are riparian wetlands that were formed in oxbows and by river action. And many of the riparian wetlands are just gone because the crops are right up to the edge and they've just sort of drowned them out, drained them out. So why do central US and California have such high losses of wetlands? I kind of already told you that, but I would like you all to answer this one for question of the day, just to make sure I've got your names in the chat. So I'm getting a lot of good answers. Population of humans, development, agriculture, irrigation, yeah, development. Where do you think development is more important than both commercial development and cities' domestic development is more important? Yeah, California. Good. Yep. Okay, make sure everyone that's on here put your name in there, because I'm not going to get you on the question of the day if you don't. So then we can talk about ecosystem functions that are based on hydrodynamic characterization. So wetlands in general are based, the way they work is based on where the water source is, right? So you can have a wetland that's just right next to a river that the water's flowing through continuously, have a nice high nutrient level. You can also have a wetland that is just a cup sort of high up, maybe in the mountains or something, and gets really pure rainwater, and then that maybe flows out, but then that's it, right? So there's no nutrients. So if the primary water source is precipitation and the climate is humid, and there's poor drainage, you'll get precipitation exceeding evapotranspiration, so the soils are waterlogged. And if the soils are constantly waterlogged, then you get peat formation and sediment anoxia. You get low plant productivity in this area, and plants rely on nutrients from the precipitation only. So these are wetlands where we might see something like pitcher plants or sundew or Venus flytrap. What is it? What is the unique characteristic of these organisms?
They're carnivorous.
Yeah, they're carnivorous. So why are they carnivorous?
They're nitrogen.
Yeah, it's low nitrogen. All the nutrients are coming in through precipitation. It doesn't have much in it unless there's a lot of atmospheric loading from air pollution or something. So they're not eating it for the carbon like most carnivores do. They're eating it for the nitrogen and phosphorus that are in those insects. Surface flow from a flooding river. So these are riparian wetlands. Floods occur annually, at least annually. And the higher the wetland is from the river, the less long it's inundated, and the more ephemeral it is. And you get a lot of nutrient and sediments coming in, and there can be a high production and high habitat heterogeneity. We get to talk about things like the Amazon River. That's really important in there. Groundwater influx, so springs and seeps sometimes. So much of we have little tiny wetlands on Kanza that are just basically where water's seeping out of the hillside. The more permanent the aquifer and the permanent the springs, the higher the spring flow, that dominates the throughput. Oftentimes these have high plant production, stable plant communities, because there's not floods or anything wiping them out, and they don't tend to go anoxic like these cooler sediments don't form peat like the ones up above we talked about. So we can classification of subhabitats in two wetland types. And we think about there being subhabitats within wetland. So on the top, A, we have high water, average water, and low water. And if the high water is going into a forest, we get a forested wetland, right? So that could be those cypress swamps. We have a forested wetland here in Manhattan. If you go to the linear trail, right when you go on the other side of the cement plant, there's the convergence of Wildcat Creek and the Kansas River. And when the water's high or there's high precipitation, there's a forest that's completely flooded down in there. So we have that around here too. These are great habitats for frogs and amphibians that need periodic flooding to get reproduction, and particularly if fishes can't get in there and eat the larvae. As we go down and we have more variable, the plants that stick out sometimes are called emergent. And then you have the submerged aquatic vegetation lower, things like water lilies, and we'll talk about the classifications of those plants. In this case, on the bottom one, we have the upland where there's not a wetland. And this might be a stream or something, a slow stream or something. And then we have a little part where the groundwater level is going up and down. And so when the groundwater level's up here, we have emergent wetland, but it's temporary, whereas this might be a permanent wetland because the low water never leaves it. You can imagine that each of these areas has specific plants that are living in it, specific animals that are adapted to different parts of them. One of the biggest wetland management issues in the United States is the Everglades, because the Everglades are the largest wetland in the United States. The Everglades once had a sheet of water that flowed across the lower quarter of 1/4 of Florida. So Florida is an old coral reef, and corals tend to grow up to pretty close to the surface of the ocean. So they're pretty flat when you have that. Then when the water dropped out, it left that coral reef behind. So you have an extraordinarily flat topography associated with Florida. Much of this was drained for agriculture and development. So for example, Miami, as they developed and moved from the coast inland, they drained more and more wetlands. And then north of Miami, there's a lot of agriculture, sugarcane being a big crop. And again, draining wetlands or controlling flow to make sure that the land doesn't flood. But now we realize that the Everglades are endangered by this because they're taking all the water out of the Everglades, and they're dumping a bunch of nutrients. The water that flows in is high nutrients, so you're getting shifts in the communities. And there's billions of dollars being spent by Florida on restoring natural flows. So to do this, these 700 kilometers of canals, 9 large pump stations, 18 gated culverts, 16 spillways are used to control hydrology. So you can imagine what would be something that would just put a huge amount of water in that would be difficult to deal with in that part of the world.
Like a hurricane?
Yeah, hurricanes come through, right? So they're putting massive amounts of water through. And so in that case, you've got to move water out or make sure the polluted water doesn't get in at least, right? And in the other sense, we might have a drought time, and then you need to make sure that the water keeps flowing in Florida and through the Everglades. So here's the historic thing. Lake Okeechobee is a large lake, and it flowed out into the ocean, but then a lot of the sheet of water came across Florida and worked its way out into the Gulf of Mexico here. And we have sawgrass marsh, lily dominated deep water, wet prairie as you get a little bit higher, cypress forest. There's a band of cypress forest along the edge of it. Marsh and sawgrass and trees, and then swamp forest up next to Lake Okeechobee. So this is what it was. And then here sort of shows this, and again, in a simulated image of this called ridge and slough. So you can see these areas of areas of forest as you work through here, and these teardrop shapes as the water flows around and they cause streamlining essentially. because they deposit sediments on the bottom and erode at the top, and they erode off the sides. So this water then was working its way across there. Now we have Miami, West Palm Beach, all this cropland right here, right? This is all cropland between Okeechobee and there. We have these series of giant wetland impoundments that are being used to trap that phosphorus coming off of there and deposit it and not allow it into the Everglades. So we can
What
see,
is-
go
What
ahead.
do the colors on, and what's the difference? Is this a time difference from the left to the right, or is it showing different things?
Yes, it's a time difference. So the one on the left is simulated colors of green would be forests, blue is the bluer it is deeper water.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, so we get big cypress trees here, and then red is a cropland here. So this is a real image, and it uses infrared. So this tends to be cropland here. We can see some forested areas up in here. The urban areas is a weird mixture between what looks like cropland and what looks like forest, but it's, it's just a mixture of that.
So are we just seeing, is this meant to show just how much drier the picture of the right on the right is?
That's right, how much drier it is, and where the sources of nutrient and other pollutions are. Additionally, in lowering flow, and between the lowering flow and increased water levels from global warming and increased sea level, saltwater intrusion is becoming more important. So where it used to be fresh down in here, it's becoming more and more saline, and this is also causing these big changes. We have some other problems associated with invasive species that will come back to this system, but I want to start with the hydrology and of the wetland. So another example of where water's flowing historically out of Lake Okeechobee, flowing down in a big sheet across. Now much of it's shot out through canals all the way down through Miami and through these two outlets of Okeechobee to the ocean, and almost none of it makes it out. So the plan is to try to revert most of that flow back through the Everglades.